Lonely Rancher saved Apache Girl, so now by sacred law she must bear his child. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. "You pulled me back from death," the Apache woman whispered. "By the sacred law of my people, I now belong to you, and I must bear you children." The words would come later, but before that night, before her voice broke the silence of his cabin, James Callahan had only the company of wind, wood, and memory. It was the winter of 1885, a season that still carried the bite of snow across the Wyoming basin. The land stretched wide and harsh, sage and rock, creek and cottonwoods, an empty sweep where the sound of a man's breath seemed to vanish into the cold. James lived at the far edge of it, where fence posts leaned against the weather and a one-room cabin held back the loneliness of the plains. He was 35, his body hardened by years of work, though his eyes carried the weariness of wars and funerals. The Union blue he had once worn was long gone, but the scars remained, one across his forearm, another deep inside where no blade had touched. He had buried a wife after fever, a child before its first birthday. Since then, his life had been pared down to wood smoke, horse feed, and silence. On nights like this, with the wind pushing grit against the cabin walls and the stovepipe clattering in protest, James sharpened his knife by lantern light. The steady scrape of steel against stone was his only rhythm, a sound that kept the memories at bay. He had chosen this life, far from town, where no one asked questions and no one expected answers. But solitude has a way of making a man hear things he might otherwise ignore. That night, above the hiss of the wind, James caught something different. Not the creak of wood, not the call of a horse. Softer than both, yet heavy enough to pull him from the table. He set down the knife, pulled his coat from the peg, and stepped outside with a lantern in hand. The cold struck him first, sharp as a blade. The lantern's glow cut across the frozen ground, past the fence line until it caught on a shape collapsed in the snow. James's chest tightened with the old reflex of war. For a moment he braced for a trick, some ambush waiting in the dark. But then he saw it, the long black braid, the bare legs half buried in frost, the torn deerskin dress clinging to a body too still. She lay face down, her skin bronze against the white, her hands marked with rope burns. Beads and shells clung to the seams of her dress, most broken, some scattered in the snow like tiny relics of another life. James lowered to one knee, lantern shaking faintly in his grip. He touched her shoulder, cold, yet faintly breathing. He lifted her carefully, unsettled by how light she was, lighter than a sack of grain, as if the world had already stripped her of everything. Turning back to the cabin, the wind hard at his heels, James knew one thing with certainty. Whatever life he had built in solitude would not remain the same after this night. Inside, the cabin closed against the wind with a dull thud. James laid the woman on his bed, his lantern casting a weary glow across the room. For a long moment he stood there, hands clenched, breath uneven. He had built this place to escape entanglements, to live by work and silence. And yet, here she was, an uninvited choice between turning away or saving a life. He knelt beside her. Dirt and dried blood streaked her face, her lips cracked and gray. He fetched water from the stove, dampened a cloth, and wiped gently at her skin. The cloth came away stained, revealing bruises along her temple, the cruel rings of rope burns at her wrists. His jaw tightened. Someone had left her to die. James draped his coat across her thin frame, its weight swallowing her shoulders. He placed bread and beans on the table nearby, close enough for her to smell when she woke. Then he sat in the lone chair, boots planted on the rough floorboards, watching her chest rise and fall in shallow rhythm. The night dragged slow. The stove ticked, the lantern swayed faintly with each draft. James kept his vigil, memories pressing close, battlefields where he'd watched men fade the same way, graves back east that had left him hollow. He muttered under his breath, not expecting she could hear, "They left you to die, but I won't." Morning came pale and reluctant, light seeping through the small window. The fire had burned to embers, but the room still held a faint warmth.
James rose stiffly, poured water into the kettle, then returned to her side. Her breathing was steadier now. He had not moved her dress aside, yet the bruises along her arms and legs told enough. Then her eyelids fluttered. She stirred beneath the weight of his coat, eyes opening at last, dark, wary, and sharp even through exhaustion. For a long moment she said nothing, only studied him as though measuring whether he was a threat. James kept his hands visible on his knees, voice low. Water. He set a cup within her reach and stepped back. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it, drinking in careful swallows as though the cup might vanish. When it was empty, she held it in both hands, eyes still fixed on him. Then she spoke, her voice ragged but steady. "You saved me. So now, according to the sacred law of my people, I must bear you children." The words hung in the cabin like smoke. James froze, caught unprepared. He had expected fear, perhaps a plea for shelter. Not this. "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "No law binds you here. You owe me nothing." Her brow furrowed, not in anger, but in confusion, as though she couldn't fathom why he would refuse what her people taught. "My people say, if a man saves a woman's life, she must give him life in return. So no one remains alone." James exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing at the memory of her bruises, the way her body had felt half-starved in his arms. "You've had enough taken from you," he answered. "This house, you can rest here without fear. No bargain, no debt." The lantern's glow softened her expression for just a breath, though suspicion lingered. She drew his coat tighter around her shoulders, gaze drifting around the cabin, the rifle by the door, the single chair, the bare table. A man's life built on solitude. "Why here?" she whispered, "so far from the town?" James hesitated. Part of him wanted to keep his silence, bury the past. But her eyes held steady, demanding truth. "I fought in the war," he said at last, his hand brushing the scar on his arm. "I lost my wife, lost a child too. I came here to start over, to stay clear of folks and their questions." Her lips pressed tight, as if she carried a story just as heavy, but not ready to share. She pulled the coat closer, whispering, "I was cast out. No food left, no family left. I walked until I could not." James gave a single nod. He didn't press further. "You're here now," he said simply, sliding the plate of beans toward her. "You'll eat, you'll rest, that's all that's asked." Her eyes flicked from the food to him, searching. Slowly, she lifted a bite to her lips. The silence between them was fragile, uncertain. Yet in that moment, the first threads of trust were tied. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments. The fire had burned down to a steady glow, sending a thin line of smoke through the stovepipe as dawn settled across the basin. James set a tin cup of water on the table, the steam faint in the cold air, and turned back to the bed. The woman stirred, pulling his coat closer around her shoulders. Her eyes found him where he stood near the stove, dark, watchful, no longer dulled by fever. She opened her mouth once, closed it, then finally said, "Tala." James tilted his head, unsure at first. "My name," she added. Her voice was raw, the sound of someone who had gone too long without speaking. He gave a short nod. "James Callahan." The words felt stiff, as though he hadn't introduced himself to another soul in years. They sat in silence, the fire ticking, the wind scratching against the cabin walls. He watched her fingers trace the frayed edge of the blanket. She seemed smaller in his bed, yet there was something unbent in the way her eyes stayed on him. "You asked why I was here," she said slowly. "I told you, no family, no food." Her gaze dropped. "They left me behind when the land gave nothing. My steps carried me until they could not." James leaned against the chair, the weight of her words settling heavy. He remembered towns back east when fever swept through, how neighbors shut their doors, leaving the weak to God's will. Survival made people cruel. He had seen it before. "They shouldn't have left you," he said. Tala's lips pressed together. She seemed ready to argue, to defend the choices of her people, but instead she only whispered, "I was not useful anymore." The phrase scraped something raw inside him. He remembered carrying his wife through nights of fever, how neighbors had whispered she was beyond saving, and his child, no bigger than his hands, lowered into earth before its first word. Not useful. The memory was a blade he had long tried to bury. "I fought in the war," James said, surprising himself with the admission. His voice was low, steady, but it carried the weight of years. "I buried men younger than me. Buried my wife after. Buried a child, too." He glanced down at his scarred arm, then back at her. "Came out here because there was nothing left to hold on to." Tala's eyes softened, not with pity, but recognition. She drew the coat tighter, as though trying to shield herself from both his story and her own. "You still breathe," she said after a long pause. "So do you," he answered. The silence that followed was different from the night before. Not hostile, not suspicious, but uneasy. Like ground thawing after frost, fragile but promising. James reached for the tin of beans left on the table, setting it between them. He broke off a piece of bread and placed it near her side, careful not to touch her hand. She hesitated, then took it. Their fingers brushed just once, accidental, but neither pulled away too quickly. In that small exchange, a thread was drawn. Thin, uncertain, but real. Outside, the wind rattled the fence posts. Inside, two people who had lost everything began, without meaning to share the burden of survival. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, quiet but no longer hollow. Tala moved slowly at first, her strength returning with each meal, each sip of water by the fire. She spent long hours wrapped in James's coat, her braid hanging loose, but her eyes rarely stayed idle. One morning, James found her at the small table, a box of thread open before her. The torn edge of her deerskin dress lay across her lap. Her fingers, though still bruised, worked the needle with deliberate care. Each stitch gathered the frayed cloth, pulling it back into something whole. James paused at the doorway, watching. The firelight caught the beads still dangling from the seams, their colors dulled by frost and wear. With every pass of the needle, Tala seemed to be reclaiming more than fabric. "You should rest," he said at last, his voice carrying the tone of habit rather than command. Her hands didn't stop. "If I do nothing, I remain useless." She glanced up, her gaze steady. "I cannot be useless again." James studied her, torn between telling her she owed nothing and recognizing the pride in her words. Work had saved him once, fence lines, posts, horses, endless tasks that gave his hands something to do when his heart could not bear remembering. He understood. Later that day, while he split logs outside, she carried kindling to the porch. Her steps were careful, uneven at times, but she refused to stop until the woodpile grew. When she set the last bundle down, James caught the faint tremor in her fingers. "Enough for now," he said. Tala looked at him, eyes shadowed but firm. Strength returns when it is used. Inside, she dusted flour across the table, shaping dough with slow, methodical motions. James sat nearby, mending tack, though his eyes drifted often toward her hands. The way they pressed and folded, patient and steady, filled the room with a rhythm he hadn't heard in years. When she leaned forward to check the stove, her dress shifted at the neckline, the seams still torn despite her efforts. James caught himself staring and forced his gaze back to the leather strap in his grip. He didn't want her to think pity or desire had driven him to take her in. Still, the warmth that rose unsettled him almost as much as it steadied him. She noticed his silence but said nothing. When the bread finished baking, she cut a piece and set it in front of him. Her hand brushed his as she placed it down. Both froze, just a fraction of a second, then carried on as though nothing had passed between them. Yet the air had shifted, holding something unspoken. That night, as they sat across from one another, the bread between them and the fire casting long shadows on the wall, James felt a verse stir in his memory, one his wife used to recite when sorrow pressed too deep. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. Psalm 147:3. He glanced at Tala, her face softened in the lantern's glow, her hands resting quietly on her lap. For the first time since he had buried his family, he wondered if healing was not a dream buried with them, but something that could be found again, stitched together as she had done with her dress, one thread at a time. The wind softened in the days that followed, though the air still carried the bite of winter. James decided it was time to show Tala more than the inside of the cabin. He led her around to the side, where a canvas sheet covered a stack of logs. The axe leaned against it, its handle worn smooth by years of use. Without a word, James swung once, the blade splitting the wood in a single, clean stroke. He handed the smaller pieces to Tala. She carried them to the porch, her steps slow but steady. Her arms trembled beneath the weight, yet she refused to falter. When she set the load down, James caught the flicker of determination in her eyes. "Not too much," he said. "Your strength isn't all the way back." Tala straightened, breath sharp in her chest. "If I do nothing, I remain weak. If I work, strength returns." James studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. He passed her a hatchet, smaller than the axe, and guided her hand on the handle. Her first swing glanced off, uneven. The second struck better. By the third, the log split with a satisfying crack. Tala's mouth curved into something faint, not quite a smile, but pride. James felt it echo inside him, the same pride he had clung to when work had been all that kept him alive after the war. Later, he took her to the creek. The thaw had begun, thin sheets of ice breaking along the banks. "Careful," he warned, steadying the rocks with his boot. She bent low, dipped the tin cup into the stream, and lifted it without spilling. When she turned back, the cold wind pulling strands of hair from her braid, her eyes met his. They held a brightness he had not seen before. Finally, he led her to the corral, where the gelding lifted its head over the fence. The animal snorted at the sight of her, ears twitching. Tala stepped forward slowly, hand outstretched. She whispered words in her own tongue, soft and rhythmic, as though greeting the horse in a language older than the land itself. The gelding stilled beneath her touch, pressing its muzzle into her palm. James stood back, watching. He did not understand the words, but he understood the reverence in her tone, the way she carried the memory of her people, even here, far from them. He had seen men mock such traditions, dismiss them as superstition. He did not. "You have a gift with him," James said quietly. Tala's eyes flicked to him, searching for ridicule. Finding none, she gave a small nod. "The horse listens when words carry respect." He tightened the cinch, showed her where to place her foot in the stirrup, and offered his hand. She hesitated, body tense, but then allowed him to steady her waist as she swung her leg across the saddle. For a moment she sat rigid, uncertain, her hands gripping the horn. James rested one hand lightly on the reins. "Sit deep, don't fight him, let him move beneath you." She drew in a breath, loosened her grip, and the horse shifted into a slow step. Tala's back straightened, her eyes fixed ahead. The wind pulled at her braid, the deerskin dress clinging close, but her posture carried strength, not fragility. When she looked down at James, the faintest trace of triumph sparked in her gaze. For the first time since he had carried her half dead from the snow, Tala did not seem like someone clinging to survival. She seemed like someone choosing to live. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when James saddled the gelding. The flour sack was nearly empty, coffee down to the last pinch, and the fence posts in need of nails. He had put it off as long as he could, but the trip to the trading post could no longer wait. When he stepped inside the cabin, Tala was already awake, braid neat, his coat wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes drifted to the small stack of coins on the table. "Is it enough?" she asked, voice cautious. "Enough for flour, coffee, sugar, maybe a bit of thread," James said. He avoided admitting how close it cut, how most of what he earned went into keeping the horse alive and the roof steady. Tala stood, the coat falling loose around her frame. "I will come, you should not go alone." James hesitated. He knew what some men in town muttered when Apache women walked past, the looks that turned sharp, the words spat like gravel. He didn't want those eyes on her. But he also saw the set of her jaw, the quiet pride in her voice. She had been cast out once, she would not be hidden again. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Stay close to me." The ride down into the valley was steady, the gelding carrying them across thawing earth. Tala sat the saddle straighter than before, her hands looser on the reins. James walked beside, boots crunching in the dirt. When the cluster of buildings came into view, store, blacksmith, parson's house, the air grew heavier between them. Inside the store, the air smelled of kerosene, flour, leather. Shelves lined the walls with sacks and tins stacked high. Behind the counter stood a gray-bearded man with spectacles perched low. He looked up as James entered, eyes flicking from the cowboy to Tala, then back again. His gaze lingered on her dress, the beadwork dangling loose at the seams. James felt her tense beside him. He moved slightly forward, body between her and the rest of the room. "Flour, coffee, sugar, that spool of dark thread," James said, laying the coins flat on the counter. The storekeep measured out the goods without a word. But at the far end, two men bent over their own purchases muttered under their breath. James caught the words squaw, stray. His jaw tightened. He did not turn. His hand rested lightly at his belt where no one could miss the meaning. The muttering stopped. Tala, meanwhile, wandered a few steps along the shelf. Her hand hovered over a strip of soft leather, then over a small tin of salve. She looked at James, silent, asking without asking. He gave a short nod. "For the horse tack," he said aloud, though they both knew one was for her braid and the other for her hands. When they stepped outside, Tala let out a breath she had been holding. "They do not want me here," she said quietly. "They don't have to want you," James answered, loading the goods into the saddlebag. "They just have to leave you be." He met her gaze, steady, unflinching. "I won't let anyone touch you." The wind picked up as they rode back into the basin, wide and endless beneath the pale sky. Tala's shoulders eased, the stiffness fading from her back. She had faced the eyes of the town, and though she bore their disdain, she had not faced it alone. The creek ran sharper with meltwater now, cutting fast between its banks. James led Tala along the narrow path, the gelding trailing behind. The air smelled of thaw, wet earth and pine sap carry on the wind. Tala bent low at the edge of the stream, the hem of her dress catching against a rock. She dipped the tin cup into the current, but her foot slid on the slick stone. In an instant, James caught her arm, pulling her steady before the water could take her. For a breath they stood close, her braid brushing against his sleeve, her body rigid beneath his hand. Then, slowly, the tension eased from her arm as she realized he would not let her fall. Her eyes lifted to his, searching. James cleared his throat, stepped back, and steadied the rocks with his boot. "These will take you down quick if you're not careful." Tala nodded once, her voice quiet. "I see now." She filled the cup again, this time holding her footing. When she lifted it without spilling, a faint smile touched her lips. On the walk back, the wind cut harder, sharp against their faces. Without thinking, James pulled the scarf from around his neck and draped it gently across hers, tucking the ends into her dress. Tala blinked, startled. "Why?" "So you don't freeze," he said, keeping his tone even, though something deeper stirred inside him, an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with duty. Back at the cabin, Tala lingered by the corral, her hand resting against the gelding's mane, as though drawing strength from its steadiness. When she finally stepped inside, the smell of beans already filled the air. James had set the pot over the fire, the rhythm of cooking now something they shared between them. She moved beside him without needing to be asked, slicing what little bread remained, setting the table with 2 plates. Her movements were careful but unhesitant, as though she had decided that this work was hers to claim. When they sat down, the silence between them was no longer heavy. It held the rhythm of a shared life, the scrape of a spoon, the crackle of the fire, the quiet comfort of knowing someone else's breath moved in the same room. James watched her across the table, the lantern's glow softening the lines of her face. He remembered how he had carried her in from the snow, half dead, her skin cold and bruised. Now she sat upright, steady, her eyes clearer than he had ever seen them. Tala caught his gaze and, for once, did not look away. Instead, she asked softly, "You live alone because of what you lost. Why let me stay?" James's hand tightened around his spoon. He searched for words, finding only the truth. "Because no one should be left to die out there. I know what it is to be alone too long." Her lips pressed together, as though the answer carried more weight than she expected. She lowered her gaze, but not in shame. More as if she were holding something tender she wasn't ready to release. When the meal was done, she rose, carrying her plate to the basin. James watched the way her braid swung against her back, the way her shoulders no longer hunched as if braced for a blow. The cabin no longer felt like a place built to hold one man's silence. It felt, for the first time, like the beginning of a home. The night came still and heavy, the wind settling to a low hum through the cottonwoods. The lantern burned on the table, casting a soft circle of light that pushed the shadows into the corners of the cabin. James sat at the bench, sleeves rolled up as he worked a strip of leather, his scar plain in the lamplight. Tala watched from the chair near the fire, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes lingered on the scar, the way the skin twisted uneven across his forearm. Finally, her voice broke the quiet. "That mark, how did you get it?" James stilled, his hand tightening around the leather strap. For a moment, he thought of deflecting, of burying the answer as he had so many times before. But Tala's gaze held steady, and she had already given him fragments of her truth. It was her right to ask. He set the strap aside, resting his arm on the table so the scar showed plain in the lantern's glow. "Cavalry fight," he said slowly, "back in the war. Blake, man on the other side, cut me here. He didn't live through it. I did." His voice was even, but the words carried the weight of a field soaked in mud and blood, the sound of men crying for mothers who had never come. Memories he had fought to bury clawed close, but he held them steady in his chest. Tala rose from her chair. Her steps were quiet on the floorboards as she came to the table. She reached out, her fingers brushing the scar. Her touch was light but deliberate, as if testing whether he would pull away. He didn't. She traced the line once, then turned her wrist to show her own. Faint rope marks circled her skin, nearly healed but still visible beneath the lantern light. "This is mine," she whispered. "I was bound, led like an animal. I thought I would die tied to a tree. I did not want to hide it." For the first time since he had found her in the snow, James looked at her not only with guarded sympathy, but with raw honesty. "You don't owe me anything for being alive," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not by law, not by rope, not by any man's hand. You stay because you choose to." Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with a steadiness he had not seen before. "I know," she whispered. "That is why I stay." The silence that followed was deep, carrying more than words could. She stood close, near enough that he could feel the warmth of her body in the cool room. For a long moment, neither moved, bound by the unspoken truth that they had each bared the deepest wounds of their past and found them accepted. The lantern's flame wavered, shadows bending against the cabin walls. James reached for the leather strap again, but not to work it. His hand stilled halfway, instead settling on the table, palm open. Tala's gaze dropped to it, then back to his face. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his. The cabin held its breath. The stove ticked. The wind brushed the doorframe, and two lives once broken sat joined in a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like the beginning of something whole. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The lantern burned low, its flames swaying in the draft that slipped through the cracks of the cabin walls. Shadows leaned long across the floor, softening the rough-hewn boards into something almost tender. James sat at the bench, the leather strap finished in his hands, but he hadn't moved for some time. His eyes kept drifting toward Tala. She knelt by the stove, her braid falling forward as she stoked the coals. When she rose, the fire's glow caught her face, and for a breath James forgot the weight of silence that had ruled this cabin for so many years. She stood in the circle of lamplight, her eyes lingering on him with a steadiness that unsettled and anchored him all at once. For days they had worked side by side, shared meals, carried wood, mended torn cloth and leather. The silence between them had changed, no longer a void, but something alive, pulsing with what had not yet been spoken. Tala stepped closer, her hands brushing the blanket draped across the table as though testing how near she could stand without breaking the fragile peace between them. Her eyes dropped to the scar on his arm again, then lifted to his face.
"That scar," she said softly, her accent pulling at the words, "it did not kill you. You lived." James exhaled through his nose, a low sound that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I lived, whether I wanted to or not." Her lips pressed together, then parted as though she might say more. Instead, she moved one step closer. "I lived too," she whispered. The silence stretched, thick and unyielding. James felt the thrum of his own heartbeat in his ears, the roughness of the bench beneath his palms. He had spent years building walls against this very moment, walls of solitude, of hard work, of silence. But they were crumbling now, and he knew it. Tala lifted her chin, closing the small space between them. Her mouth brushed his, uncertain at first, a question rather than a claim. James froze, then answered with a slow certainty, his hand rising to rest against her shoulder. The kiss deepened, not with urgency, but with the steady strength of two people who had walked through loss and found themselves still standing. Her hand pressed lightly against his chest, and he felt the rapid rhythm of her heartbeat through the thin fabric of his shirt. When they parted, her breath caught in the narrow space between them. She didn't step back, neither did he. The world outside had narrowed to the lantern's glow, the stove's quiet tick, and the taste of something he had thought buried with his past. James looked at her, really looked, and understood the truth that had been waiting since the night he carried her in from the snow. This was not duty, not sacred law, not pity. It was choice, and it was theirs. The lantern's glow flickered against the walls, soft and steady. After the kiss, neither of them spoke. Words felt too small for what had just passed between them. Tala's hand lingered at James's chest, her fingers splayed as if she could steady the rhythm of his heart. James covered her hand with his own, rough palm closing gently over her smaller one. He had not touched another soul this way in years, and the weight of it was almost too much to bear. "I should," he began, but stopped. What words could undo the truth already spoken in silence? Tala lifted her eyes to his, her expression unreadable, but her body did not pull away. Instead, she took his other hand and guided it slowly to her own. The scars at her wrist caught the lamplight, faint but still there. She turned her hand upward, letting his fingers trace them. "No rope now," she whispered. James's throat tightened. He bent his head, pressing his lips softly to the mark. Her breath caught, but she did not retreat. Instead, she stepped closer, until the warmth of her body pressed against his. He drew her into his arms carefully, as though afraid she might break. But Tala did not break. She leaned into him with quiet urgency, her face buried against his shoulder, her breath trembling against his neck. For the first time since he had buried his family, James allowed himself to hold someone not out of duty, but out of want. When his lips found hers again, the kiss was different, no longer tentative, but certain. Her hands rose to his face, sliding into his hair, and he felt the years of loneliness fall away beneath her touch.
He led her gently to the bed, his coat still draped across it. For a moment he paused, searching her face. "If you wish me to stop." Tala shook her head before he could finish. "I choose this." Those 3 words struck deeper than any wound he had ever carried. She was not bound by law, not by hunger, not by desperation. She was choosing him, here, now. They lay down together, the lantern burning low, the wind outside a distant hum. Their movements were careful, unhurried. James's hands traced the curve of her shoulder, the line of her back, rough fingers gentled by reverence. Tala's hands explored the scar at his side, resting there without fear. Her eyes telling him what her voice did not, that she accepted him whole, wounds and all. When they finally gave themselves to each other, it was not out of obligation, but out of trust. Not an act of survival, but of healing. Afterward, Tala rested against him, her hair loose across his chest, her breathing steady and sure. James wrapped his arm around her waist, holding her close as though anchoring her to the life they had just chosen together. For the first time in years, he did not feel the familiar hollow that came after sleep. Instead, he felt whole. Morning light spilled pale across the basin, catching the frost still clinging to the sagebrush. James woke in the chair as he often did, but this time was different.
His hand was still clasped around Tala's, their fingers joined even in sleep. When she stirred and opened her eyes, she did not pull away. Instead, she tightened her grip, as though anchoring herself to something she had chosen not to let go of. The days that followed carried a rhythm familiar, yet wholly changed. Work was the same, mending tack, splitting wood, fetching water, but the silence between them no longer felt like distance. It was filled with the small sounds of companionship, the scrape of a knife cutting bread, the low murmur of her voice when she spoke in her tongue to the gelding, the soft laugh that escaped her when flour dusted her nose as she kneaded dough. James caught himself smiling more often than he had in years. Not the hollow, fleeting smiles that masked grief, but the kind that settled deep in his chest and lingered. One afternoon, while fixing a loose hinge on the door, he heard her humming. The tune was strange to his ears, low and winding, like the sound of wind through canyon walls. He leaned in the doorway, watching her as she braided strips of cloth into a line sturdy enough for binding. She did not notice him at first.
When she did, her cheeks colored faintly, but she didn't stop. "What is it?" he asked. "A song my mother sang," she answered, her voice softened, carrying memory. "For work, for steady hands." He nodded once, swallowing the lump in his throat. He hadn't thought of lullabies or songs in years, but hearing her voice fill the cabin, he felt something knit together inside him, as though the house itself was remembering what it meant to be alive. That evening, they ate bread still warm from the fire. Tala broke a piece, set it in front of him, and when their hands touched, neither pulled away. Instead, their fingers lingered, and a quiet smile passed between them. When night came, James gestured toward the bed. "Take it," he said, as he always had. But this time, when he moved to the chair, Tala reached for him. She did not speak. She simply extended her hand, waiting. James hesitated only a moment before taking it. She guided him to sit on the edge of the bed, then lay down, leaving space beside her. For a long while, they lay without speaking, their breaths rising and falling in the same rhythm.
Her hair spilled across the pillow, the faint scent of wood smoke and flour clinging to it. At last, in the dark, her fingers found his again. He closed his rough palm around hers, holding it steady. And for the first time in years, James Callahan did not fall asleep alone. The thaw came quick, loosening the snow until the creek ran high and the cottonwoods showed their first buds. Work on the ranch shifted with the season, fence posts needing steadying, horses restless for pasture. But James found his hands turning to another task when the day's labor ended. In the corner of the cabin lay a plank of juniper he had cut months before. Its grain was tight, its scent sharp when split. One evening, he carried it to the table, set it flat, and marked a curve with a pencil.
Tala watched from her place near the stove, her hands busy with scraps of cloth she was stitching into a small square blanket. Her eyes drifted from the needle to the wood, curiosity flickering in their dark depths. "What do you shape?" she asked softly. James hesitated, the pencil still in his grip. For years, he had sworn never to let his heart think beyond the next day's work, never to risk building what could be lost. But as he looked at Tala, her hands steady at the needle, her face lit by the lantern glow, he found the truth pressing against his silence. "Something for the future," he said at last. His voice was rough, almost uncertain. "A cradle." The words seemed to hang in the cabin, tender and heavy. Tala set the cloth aside, rising slowly to stand beside him. Her hand brushed the edge of the wood, then lingered near his. "For a child?" she asked, her tone careful, almost reverent. James nodded, eyes fixed on the curve he had drawn. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I know I don't want the rest of my life to be nothing but graves and silence. I want something more." He swallowed hard, then added, almost as if to himself, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." The words, half remembered from sermons long past, steadied him as he spoke them aloud.
He had not thought of them in years, but now, with Tala standing beside him, they felt alive again. Tala's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She reached out, laying her hand gently over his scarred forearm. "Hope," she echoed, "a future." James turned his hand over, clasping hers in return. The juniper plank lay between them, but it no longer felt like just wood. It was a promise, fragile but real, shaped by their hands and their choice to move beyond survival. That night, as the lantern burned low, Tala spread the blanket she had sewn across the edge of the unfinished cradle. James watched her tie a small shell into one corner, its faint rattle singing softly when the breeze moved through the cabin. Two broken lives, once ruled by silence and loss, were beginning, quietly, steadily, to build something that could last. The cradle took shape piece by piece in the evenings, its curved rockers smoothed by James's careful hand, its frame joined tight with wooden pegs. Each night, Tala watched him work, her blanket growing longer beneath her fingers. She had sewn shells to the corners so they clicked softly when the wind stirred, a song of promise in the quiet cabin. One morning, as the sun spilled across the basin, James drove the last peg into place. He set the small cradle by the window where light could fall across it, then stepped back, rubbing the sawdust from his hands. Tala came to stand beside him, her face bright in the glow of day. She laid the finished blanket across the cradle, smoothing it with deliberate care. Then, instead of stepping back, she took his hand and placed it gently against her middle. At first, James didn't understand. Her frame was still slender, her dress still loose. But the weight of her gaze, the steadiness in her touch, told him what words had not yet said. "It is not just for a future we hope for," she whispered. "It is for the child already inside me." The air in James's chest turned heavy, as if all the years of grief had rushed back at once. He had buried a child once, too small to breathe more than a handful of days. He had told himself that part of his life was gone, sealed in earth and silence. And yet here, in the cabin he had built to keep the world away, life had found him again. His hand trembled against her belly. No movement stirred beneath his palm, not yet, but the promise of it was enough to root him to the ground. He drew her against him, pressing his face into her hair, his voice rough and low. "You'll never be cast out again," he said, "not by law, not by hunger, not by men. You are mine. This child is ours, I swear it." Tala closed her eyes, her arms circling his shoulders. She leaned into him with a steadiness that spoke not of desperation, but of choice. James held her there, the cradle within arm's reach, the smell of juniper wood still fresh in the room. The ache of his buried past had not vanished, but for the first time it no longer felt like an open wound.
It felt like soil, deep and heavy, but ready at last to hold something new. When Tala pulled back to look at him, her lips trembled with something that was not fear. "You believe this child will live?" James tightened his hold on her hands. "Yes," he said, steady now, "this child will live, and so will we." The shell on the blanket rattled faintly as the wind touched it, a small sound, but enough to carry the weight of hope through the cabin. The morning was clear when James saddled the gelding, the sky wide and pale above the basin. Tala rode behind him, her braid neat, her dress mended with careful stitches. The cradle waited back in the cabin, its blanket folded, its shell tied to one corner. Ahead lay the valley and the parson's small house, where vows would be spoken. They rode in silence, but it was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who knew what words would soon seal. Tala's hand rested lightly at James's waist, steadying herself with each step of the horse. He felt the warmth of her touch even through his coat, a reminder that the life he thought buried was stirring again. The church was little more than a whitewashed room with a bell hung in a crooked frame outside. The parson, gray-haired and thin, greeted them with a kind nod. A handful of townsfolk had gathered too. Curiosity carried quickly in places where news was rare. Some eyes were wary, some sharp, but James ignored them. Inside, the parson opened his book, its pages thick with names inked over years of baptisms, marriages, and burials. He looked at James first. "Do you come here of your own will?" "I do," James answered, his voice steady. Then to Tala, "And you?" Tala's accent wrapped around the words, but her meaning rang clear. "I do." The parson nodded, then asked James to take her hand. James did so, his rough palm closing gently over hers. For a moment, the scars on their skin seemed to mirror one another. Wounds carried, now joined. "You vow to keep her," the parson said, "in hunger or in plenty, in hardship or in rest, as long as breath remains?" "I vow it," James said, his gaze locked on Tala's. "And you?" the parson turned to her. "Do you vow the same?" "I vow," Tala whispered, her voice trembling but sure. The parson smiled faintly, dipping his pen in ink. He bent over the book and wrote her name beside James's, sealing the vows not just with words, but with ink that would outlast them both. When he closed the book, he lifted his hand in blessing. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Outside, the small bell tolled once, its sound carrying across the valley. The townsfolk watched as James helped Tala down from the horse, her hand never leaving his. Some still frowned, some whispered, but none spoke aloud. Tala stood tall at his side, her braid catching the light, her shoulders squared. She turned to James, her voice quiet but firm. "I stay because I choose you, not for law, not for fear. This is my place now." James pulled her close, his arm firm around her shoulders. For the first time in years, he smiled without restraint. Together, they stepped back toward the basin, husband and wife, the cradle waiting by the window for the life they had already begun. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The basin had changed with the seasons. Where once the land lay frozen and silent, now the creek ran full, its waters cutting quick through the sage. Cottonwoods shimmered green along the banks, their branches alive with birds returning after winter. For James Callahan, the change outside mirrored the change within his cabin. The place no longer carried only the rhythm of one man's footsteps. It echoed now with softer sounds. The clink of Tala's beads as she moved through the room, the rustle of cloth as she sewed, the low hum of her voice when she sang in her language while kneading bread. The silence that had once weighed heavy over the house had been replaced by something gentler, the quiet music of two lives woven together. By the window stood the cradle. James had sanded it smooth, each curve shaped with patient hands. Tala had lined it with the blanket she had stitched, the shell tied to one corner. When the breeze slipped through the cracks, the shell rattled faintly, its song a reminder of what was to come. One afternoon, James found Taylor standing over it, her palm resting against the roundness just beginning to show beneath her dress. She had grown stronger with each passing week, the hollows of her cheeks filled with health, the bruises long faded. But when she turned to look at him, her eyes carried something deeper than strength, certainty. "You built this with your hands," she said, brushing the edge of the cradle, "but also with your heart." James swallowed, his throat tightening. He remembered carving the curve of wood while telling himself it was only a task, only work to keep his hands busy. But it had been more. With each cut, he had been shaping a place not just for a child, but for a life he had thought lost forever.
"I built it for us," he said quietly. Tala stepped close, her hand slipping into his. "For us," she echoed. Their days fell into a rhythm of preparation. James rode to town for flour and nails, ignoring the whispers that followed them now less boldly than before. Tala baked bread and dried herbs, careful to set aside food for the months to come. Together they worked the small plot near the cabin, turning earth with the stubborn hope that it would yield enough. Some evenings, James read aloud from the worn Bible he had carried west but never opened since the war. The words had gathered dust, much like his faith, but now they seemed to breathe again when spoken aloud. Tala listened, her hand resting on her belly, her eyes steady on him. One night, as the fire crackled low, she asked, "Do you believe God brought me to your fence?" James stared into the flames. For years he had avoided questions of God's will, too bitter over graves dug too soon. But here, with Tala beside him, her life stirring into another, he felt the old anger giving way to something gentler. "I think," he said slowly, "he knew I needed someone to remind me life wasn't over." "Maybe he knew you needed someone too." Tala leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then he gave us to each other." James wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. The weight of the past still lived in him, but it no longer ruled him. The war, the fever, the graves, they had shaped him, but they had not ended him. Now the future stretched ahead, uncertain but real. A wife at his side, a child on the way, a cabin no longer haunted by silence, but alive with love. And as the shell on the cradle rattled softly in the breeze, James knew the sound was not a reminder of what had been lost, but a promise of what was yet to come. The summer sun burned high over the basin when the child came. The air was heavy with the scent of sage and dust, the creek swollen from rains farther north. Inside the cabin, the stove stood cold, every window thrown open to let in the wind. Tala gripped James's hand, her braid damp with sweat, her breath ragged with the effort of bringing life into the world. James had faced gunfire, seen men fall in the mud of battlefields, carried his wife through fever until she slipped from his arms. But nothing had ever filled him with such fear and awe as watching Tala now, straining, crying out, refusing to break. "Breathe," he whispered, though his own lungs felt tight. "You're strong, stronger than anyone I've known." Her fingers crushed his, but he did not pull away. He would have borne all of it for her if he could. Instead, he stayed, steady, the anchor she clung to as the hours dragged. And then, at last, the cabin filled with a new sound, the sharp, startling cry of a child drawing its first breath. Tala collapsed back against the blankets, tears streaking her face, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion and relief. James lifted the child, his rough hands gentled as though cradling the most fragile thing he had ever touched. The baby's fists flailed, its skin slick and warm, its cries fierce against the hush of the room. For a long moment, James could not move. His vision blurred, and he blinked hard, the weight of years pressing against his chest. He had thought never to hold a child of his own again. And now, against all that grief had tried to take, here was life. He placed the child gently into Tala's arms.
She held it close, her lips brushing the small head, her voice breaking on a whisper, "Our child." James sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his hand resting over hers as she cradled the newborn. The world outside, the prejudice of townsfolk, the memory of war, the loneliness of years gone, fell away in that moment. Only the three of them existed, a man who had thought himself finished, a woman once cast out, and the life they had made together. The shell tied to the cradle rattled faintly as the wind moved through the cabin, as though welcoming the child with its song. James rose, carried the baby with careful hands, and laid it in the cradle. The juniper wood creaked softly, the blanket bright beneath the newborn's small form. Tala reached for James's hand. "You kept your vow," she said, her voice weak but certain. James turned to her, his throat thick. "And I always will." That night, as the stars filled the sky over the basin, James sat awake by the cradle, listening to the baby's breathing, the quiet hum of Tala's sleep. He thought of the graves he had left behind, the silence that had once been his only companion. He thought of the war, the fever, the loneliness.
And then he thought of now, the warmth of the cabin, the promise of the child, the steady presence of the woman who had walked out of the snow into his life. He remembered words he had once doubted but now felt true in his bones. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. James reached down, brushing a finger across his child's tiny hand. The grip that closed around him was small but unyielding, a hold that spoke of a future greater than anything he had dared to dream. In the quiet cabin, under the wide sky of the frontier, James Callahan knew this truth. His wandering was over. The story of loss had ended. The story of life had begun. Stories like James and Tala's remind us that even in the harshest places, the windswept frontier, the lonely cabin, the battles of grief, there is always a chance for new life to take root. The Wild West was more than gunfights and dust. It was a land where broken hearts sought healing, where strangers became family, and where hope rose from ashes. Perhaps you too have known loss, silence, or the ache of being left behind. And yet, like them, you've discovered that compassion, faith, and the courage to love again can build a future stronger than the past. That is the heart of true Wild West stories. Not just survival, but redemption and grace. If this story touched you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs hope, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your story matters too.